There's something about the chill of autumn air that feels different, heavier somehow, like it's carrying more than just the cold. I remember that night vividly, not because of the excitement of sneaking into the abandoned church, but because of how everything changed for us in just a few moments. We were just kids, really. High school seniors, sure, but not much more than that. Still trying to figure out who we were, clinging to the last threads of childhood. We had been to the old church countless times. It was our spot, a place where the world couldn't find us. For years, the six of us, me, Max, Allie, Drew, Kale, and Tori, would gather in that decaying building, hiding from the pressures of life, school, and everything else. We were inseparable, always daring each other to push limits, always trying to outdo each other. And that night, we were just looking for a good time. I didn't know it would be the last time we'd ever go back. The church stood alone in the woods, forgotten, like an old, sad memory. The spire was broken, the window shattered, and the door barely hanging on its rusted hinges. Every time we went there, it felt like a piece of history was holding on by a thread, refusing to let go. And maybe that's why we kept going back, because in a way, we felt the same. It wasn't about the thrill of being somewhere we weren't supposed to be. It was about feeling like we were part of something bigger, something that had lived long before us and would continue long after we were gone. That night, the air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decaying wood as we climbed over the fence. The leaves crunched beneath our feet, the sound louder than I expected in the otherwise quiet woods. Max was the first to squeeze through the cracked side window, same as always with Allie right behind him. She always followed Max no matter what. I sometimes wondered if she did it because she was fearless or because she was afraid of being left behind. The inside of the church hadn't changed. It was the same eerie, broken-down shell it had always been. The floorboards creaked under our weight as we stepped carefully around the gaping hole in the center, the one that led down to the basement. It was like the heart of the church had rotted out, leaving only darkness behind. We laughed, joked, trying to shake off the tension that always seemed to hang in the air in that place. It was familiar to us, but it still had a way of creeping under your skin if you let it. Maybe that's why we brought drinks that night, to drown out the weird feeling that something was always watching, always waiting. We made our way down to the basement, where we had spent so many nights before. It was colder down there, the air heavy and still. The basement had a few rooms, most of them empty, their doorways gaping open like mouths. But there was one room, the one at the far end, that had a door. A door that, no matter how many times we tried, had never opened. We didn't think about it too much. The church was old, and there were always strange things in old places. We set up in one of the larger rooms, sitting on the dusty floor, the light from our flashlights dancing off the crumbling walls. For a little while, everything felt normal, like it always did. We passed around the bottles, joked about how the church was haunted, how maybe we should make up some new ghost stories to scare each other. But the truth was, there was always a part of me that didn't need to make up stories. Something about that place made me uneasy. I couldn't explain it, but every time we went there, I felt like there was something just out of sight, something waiting in the shadows. I never said anything, though. It was easier to laugh it off with the others, to pretend I was as fearless as Max, as carefree as Allie. We were talking, laughing, when it happened. A door slammed, loud and angry, echoing through the basement like a shot. The sound froze us, the laughter dying in our throats. For a moment, no one moved. We just stared at each other, wide-eyed, the reality of what we heard sinking in. My heart pounded in my chest, the fear hitting me so fast I could barely think. And then Drew was up, bolting for the stairs, with Kale and Tori right behind him. Their panic was contagious, making my breath catch in my throat. They didn't even look back. I watched them scramble up the stairs, their footsteps fading, leaving the three of us, me, Max, and Allie, standing there in the suffocating silence. Max was the first to break the stillness, his jaw clenched. "It's probably nothing," he said, but I could hear the edge in his voice. He didn't believe his own words. Allie was pale, her hands trembling, but she nodded, determined not to show fear. I wanted to run too, but something held me back. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was the same thing that kept me coming back to that place. even when I knew something wasn't right. "We should check it out," Max said, his voice steady, but his eyes betrayed him. I swallowed hard, trying to push down the fear that was clawing at my chest. I didn't want to be the coward, so I followed. We moved slowly, cautiously, toward the door at the far end of the basement, the one that had always been stuck. But now it wasn't. It stood ajar, just enough for us to see inside. Max pushed it open, the door creaking as it swung inward. The room was small, empty except for one thing: a mirror, cracked and covered in dust. But that wasn't what made my stomach turn. There was something else smeared across the glass. Something red, wet, and unmistakably fresh. Blood. Ally gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Max stood frozen, his fists clenched at his sides, trying to hold on to his courage. But before any of us could react, another sound echoed through the room behind us. A soft, shuffling noise that made my blood run cold. Something was there with us. The sound, so subtle yet so wrong, turned my body rigid. It came from the room we had just left, like the faint scuffle of feet across stone. Max and Allie must have heard it too, because I saw the same terror flash across their faces, even if they tried to hide it. In that moment, no one spoke. We stood still, hearts hammering, eyes locked on the darkness behind us, knowing we weren't alone. It was Allie who broke first. Her breath came out in shallow, panicked gasps as she grabbed Max's arm, her fingers digging into his jacket. "We need to go," she whispered, barely audible, her voice shaking with the fear she had tried so hard to suppress. Max didn't argue. His bravado had crumbled, the fearless leader reduced to a boy standing on the edge of terror. "Yeah," he muttered, his voice tight. "Let's get the hell out of here." We moved quickly but cautiously toward the stairs, trying to keep calm, even though every instinct screamed to run. I kept glancing behind me, unable to shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching us. My mouth felt dry, my pulse pounding in my ears so loud it drowned out everything else. The church, which had always felt eerie but harmless, now felt like a trap. Every shadow seemed to grow, closing in on us, pulling at the edges of my mind. As we reached the stairs, I felt a shiver run down my spine, the hairs on my neck standing up. I turned one last time, and that's when I saw it. In the dim glow of my flashlight, standing in the open doorway of the room we had just left, was a figure, a tall, dark silhouette, unmoving, its face obscured by the shadows. I stopped dead in my tracks, unable to tear my eyes away. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there watching. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Was it a trick of the light? My imagination? But no matter how much I wanted to believe that, I couldn't. This wasn't in my head. This was real. "Guys!" I choked out, my voice trembling. Max and Allie turned to see what had paralyzed me, and when they did, Allie let out a small, terrified whimper. Max's face drained of color, his mouth set in a tight line. He grabbed my arm, his grip hard and desperate. "Don't look at it, just go!" he hissed, his voice barely controlled. I forced my legs to move, climbing the stairs with shaky steps, each one feeling like it took more effort than the last. Behind us, the basement felt like it was closing in, like the walls were coming alive, breathing down our necks. I could hear Allie's soft sobs as she struggled to keep herself together, and even though Max was trying to keep calm, I could feel his fear vibrating off him. We burst out of the basement, back into the main hall of the church, but it didn't feel any safer. The wind howled through the broken windows, rattling the rotting wood. The hole in the floor gaped wide like a black maw waiting to devour us. For a split second, we stood frozen, unsure of what to do, of where to go. The entrance we'd come through seemed impossibly far, and then the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from the basement. I didn't look back this time. I couldn't. I didn't need to see it again to know it was following us. Max and Allie didn't say a word. We just ran. The three of us sprinted across the uneven floor, dodging debris, our breath ragged and desperate. The only thing that mattered was getting out. Nothing else existed but that door, that window, that one way out. We scrambled through the same window we'd entered, barely caring about the sharp glass still jutting from its edges. I felt it slice into my arm as I pulled myself through, but the adrenaline drowned out the pain. Max helped Allie over the fence, then we followed, our feet barely hitting the ground before we were off again, running through the woods. The church loomed behind us, shrinking with every step we took, but it felt like the darkness inside it was stretching, reaching out for us, trying to pull us back. The figure, the thing that had been watching us, was burned into my mind. I couldn't stop thinking about it, couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over, that it would follow us, find us. Finally, when we were far enough away that the church was just a silhouette against the night sky, we stopped, collapsing onto the cold ground, gasping for air. Allie sobbed quietly, hugging her knees to her chest, her whole body trembling. Max sat beside her, silent, his face pale and blank, as though he was still processing what had just happened. I didn't say anything. I couldn't. I kept staring back toward the church, half expecting to see the figure standing at the edge of the trees, waiting for us. But there was nothing, only darkness. The silence between us felt heavy, suffocating. None of us wanted to admit what we had seen, what had happened. It was easier to pretend it hadn't, to tell ourselves that it was just our minds playing tricks on us, that the church was just an old broken building, nothing more. But deep down, I knew better. We all did. None of us ever went back to that church. We didn't talk about it. The others, Drew, Kale, Tori, asked what had happened, but we never gave them a straight answer. How could we? They hadn't seen it. They hadn't felt that cold, gnawing fear that gripped us the moment that door slammed. Years later, the church was demolished, and part of me felt relieved, like maybe whatever was in there had finally been buried, gone for good. But there's another part of me, the part that still wakes up some nights covered in sweat, that wonders if it's still out there, waiting, watching. And I think about the silhouette in the window, about how in that moment, it didn't feel like we were trespassing. It felt like we were being invited in. I still see it sometimes, in the corners of my vision, in the dark of my room, and every time it's like that night all over again. And I remember that we left something behind in that church, or maybe something followed us out.